Nobody expected them. That was the point. They didn't arrive with guns. They didn't arrive with badges or cattle, or the kind of authority that announced itself loudly and dared the frontier to respond. They arrived with ledgers, with contracts, with legal language so dense and so carefully constructed that by the time anyone understood what it said, the land had already changed hands, and the changing was already irreversible. The Wild West was won by lawyers and accountants, by railroad executives sitting in mahogany offices in New York and Boston and London, moving pieces across maps they had never visited, making decisions about land they had never seen, extracting wealth from people and places they would never meet. By the time the Cowboys understood what had happened, the Cowboys were employees. And then they were former employees. And then they were a story someone else was selling. Stay with me? Because the question of who actually won the Wild West is the question that the mythology was specifically constructed to prevent you from asking. And the answer, when you look at it directly, changes everything you thought you understood about what the frontier was and what it was for. The first thing you need to understand is what winning means. In the version of the Wild West that the movies gave you, winning is personal. It is the gunfighter who outdraws his opponent, the sheriff who cleans up the town, the settler who builds something permanent on the land he claimed. Individual people, individual contests, individual outcomes determined by individual qualities: courage, speed, endurance, moral clarity. That version of winning happened. Those individual contests were real. The courage was real. The endurance was real. But that version of winning was not the winning that mattered. The winning that mattered was structural. It happened in legislatures and courtrooms and corporate boardrooms, and the offices of land agents and the counting houses of Eastern banks. It happened in the language of contracts and the mechanics of debt, and the specific legal architecture of an expanding nation deciding who would own what, and under what conditions, and with what protections. It happened before most of the people who thought they were players in the game understood they were pieces. The railroads won first and most completely. We have talked about the railroads before. The promotional material, the settlers recruited, and the land grants extracted. But the full scope of what the railroads took from the frontier is worth understanding as a single number. The federal government granted the railroad companies approximately 170 million acres of land as part of the deal that financed the transcontinental and the rail lines that followed it. 170 million acres, an area larger than the state of Texas, given to private companies, in exchange for building infrastructure that those same companies would then profit from operating. The land was not empty when it was granted. It was occupied by people who had not been consulted about the transaction. It contained resources, timber, minerals, water, and the accumulated ecological productivity of centuries that the railroad companies did not need to develop themselves and did not need to develop quickly. They needed to hold it, to control access to it, to be the entity that determined what happened to it and who profited from what happened, which is what they did. The land-grant railroads became, within 2 decades of the Transcontinental's completion, some of the largest landowners in American history. Not farmers, not settlers, landlords. The people who actually broke the ground and planted the crops and built the towns were tenants in a system that the railroads had structured to ensure that the primary economic benefit of Western development flowed toward the companies that held the land rather than the people working it. This is not a subtle or debatable point, and it is the documented history of how Western land was distributed and who profited from that distribution. The settlers who came west believing the promotional material, believing that the land was theirs to claim and develop and own free and clear if they were willing to work for it. Those settlers were not wrong that work was required. They were wrong about who the work ultimately benefited. The banks came second and stayed longest. The individual settler arriving in Kansas or Nebraska or Dakota Territory with the intention of farming needed things that working a farm for the first few years could not yet provide: seed, equipment, structures, the basic capital investment that agriculture requires before it begins to generate returns. They needed loans. The banks provided them at rates that reflected the leverage banks had over people who needed money and had land as their only collateral and no alternative source of credit, at terms that were structured to ensure that a bad year, a drought year, a grasshopper year, a year when the market price for wheat dropped below the cost of producing it, would trigger the kind of default that transferred the land from the settler to the bank efficiently and legally. The bad years came, they always came. The banks foreclosed, not as an aberration of the system, as the system functioning as designed. The land that settlers had broken and developed and improved through years of difficult work transferred to the banks that had lent against it, and the banks sold it to the next wave of settlers. And the cycle repeated, with the bank extracting value at every transfer, while the people doing the agricultural work absorbed the risk of the climate and the market. By the 1890s, the populist movement that emerged from the farming communities of the Great Plains was explicitly about this dynamic. The farmers who joined the Populist Party were not confused about what had happened to them. They understood the mechanics of the debt system and the crop lien system and the railroad pricing system with the specific clarity of people who had been living inside those mechanics for decades. They described it clearly. They called it a system designed to transfer wealth from the people who produced it to the people who controlled the financial infrastructure through which it moved. They were correct. They lost anyway. Why? Because winning political arguments about economic structure requires political power, and political power in the 1890s required either votes or money. And the farmers had votes, and the banks and railroads had money. And in the American political system of the 1890s, money turned out to be the more effective input. The cattle barons came third and burned brightest and collapsed fastest. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association and its equivalents in other territories represented the concentrated power of men who had built enormous cattle operations on land they did not own, using labor they underpaid, in a political environment they controlled through the strategic application of wealth to the people who made decisions. For a decade, they were as close to feudal lords as the American frontier produced. They controlled the roundups. They controlled the shipping. They controlled the employment. They controlled the territorial governments, and through them the courts and the law enforcement that was supposed to regulate them. They blacklisted workers who organized. They called homesteaders rustlers. They hired mercenaries to kill the people they found inconvenient. And then the winter of 1886 to 87 came, and the cattle died, and the economic model that had made the cattle barons powerful turned out to have been built on a foundation: the open range, the free grass, the assumption of continued mild winters, that the first severe test destroyed completely. The great cattle operations restructured, smaller, fenced, more rational, less profitable at the scale that had made them dominant. Yet the men who had run the Wyoming Stock Growers Association with the confidence of people who owned the territory found that what they had owned was not the territory, but a particular set of conditions, that the conditions themselves had now ended. They retreated to their estates. They remained wealthy. They never again had the specific kind of power they had exercised in the decade before the winter. The speculators won quietly and continuously, without ever becoming the subject of a single dime novel. The land speculator of the frontier era was not a dramatic figure. He did not ride horses or carry guns or make decisions that produced immediate visible outcomes. He sat in offices in eastern cities and bought land on paper, land he had never seen, that he would never visit, and that he held as a financial instrument rather than a place, and waited for the settlers and the development and the rising prices that the promotional mythology was delivering to him. He did not do the promotional work himself. The railroads did it, the newspapers did it, the dime novels did it. All of that effort and expense and organizational sophistication was producing as one of its primary outputs rising land values that accrued to the people who had bought land early and held it. The speculator held it. When the settlers arrived and the towns formed and the agricultural development began and the infrastructure went in, the land values rose. The speculator sold. At prices that reflected not his own investment, he had done nothing to improve the land, but the investment of every settler and every community and every public dollar that had gone into making the surrounding area more valuable. He took the appreciation. He had contributed the capital. The capital had done its work without him having to do anything. This is how significant portions of the Western land transferred from public domain to private hands and then to a relatively small number of private hands without anyone who was watching the cowboys and the gunfighters and the sheriffs noticing that the real transaction was happening somewhere else entirely. The lawyers wrote the contracts that made all of it stick. When the importance of legal infrastructure to the winning of the West cannot be overstated and is almost entirely absent from the mythology, which prefers the clarity of the gun to the complexity of the contract. But the contract lasted longer. The gun decided individual conflicts. The contract decided who owned the outcome of those conflicts. Every piece of land that changed hands through violence or pressure or the simple displacement of people who didn't have legal standing to resist, that land became legally held through the document that followed the event, the patent, the deed, the title, the legal instrument that converted physical possession into permanent ownership, recognized by courts that the new government controlled and the displaced people did not. The lawyers who wrote those instruments, who filed those patents, who argued the land cases in the territorial courts, those men shaped the permanent distribution of Western land more completely than any gunfighter shaped anything. Their names are not in the dime novels. Their offices are not recreated in the theme parks. Their work is in the title records of every county in the American West. And who won in the end? Look at who owns the West now, not who lives there. Who owns it? The largest private landowners in the American West are not the descendants of homesteaders, not the families of cowboys who built something through hard work on the frontier. One of the largest landowners are corporations and investment funds, and the inherited estates of the families who were positioned correctly in the 1870s and 80s to accumulate land when land was being distributed and have been positioned correctly ever since to hold it. Ted Turner owns 2 million acres of the American West. The federal government owns approximately 640 million acres, lands held in public trusts that are managed by agencies whose policies are shaped by the lobbying of the industries that use them. And the homesteaders who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of the Homestead Act, the act that was supposed to distribute Western land to the people willing to work it. The total land transferred to individual settlers through the Homestead Act over its entire history of operation was approximately 270 million acres. The railroads alone received 170 million acres as a gift for building infrastructure they then profited from. The mythology says the West was won by brave individuals who went out there and earned what they got through courage and hard work and the willingness to face danger. Some of them did. And then the contracts caught up with them, and the banks caught up with them, and the railroad pricing caught up with them, and the drought caught up with them. And what they had built transferred legally and permanently to the people who had structured the system to ensure that the transfer happened. The cowboy is the symbol of the American West. He is on the hats and the belt buckles and the boots and the album covers and the political imagery of half the country. He is not who won. He was what winning looked like from the outside. Inside, it looked like a ledger. It looked like a land grant. It looked like a loan at 12% interest secured by a quarter section of Kansas prairie that a bank in Chicago would foreclose on in the third drought year. Where it looked like a railroad contract and a political connection and a legal instrument filed in a territorial court by a lawyer whose name nobody remembers and whose work shaped the ownership of the American West more completely than every gunfight that ever happened. The cowboys rode into the sunset. The lawyers took the land. The banks took the farms. The railroads took the continent. And the myth took everything else, turned it golden, sold it back to us, and we bought it every single time.